You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
9 out of 10 doctors agree. We'll be right back.
No one can escape the long arm of the law on Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 26, The Psychiatrist. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Norman Lau.
And I'm Earl Green. Each week on Gene-ology, we don't shrink from our duty to dig into the Roddenberry archives and examine Gene Roddenberry's earliest TV writing.
This week, we're doing a one-week tour of duty with the Harbor Command as they try to protect the life of the psychiatrist. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at MissionLogPod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here's Earl Green with this week's therapy. Trivia. This week's trivia.
Trivia can be therapy, thank you very much, Norm. This episode of Harbor Command, another one-season wonder from the Ziv television program's TV Factory, is another co-writing credit of sorts, this time between Gene Roddenberry and William Driscoll. Both men got into the professional TV writing business at about the same time, and like Gene, Driscoll had several credits on other Ziv shows to his name, including 9 episodes of Highway Patrol, 3 of them involving helicopters. I mean, it's okay if you have a thing, if that's your thing. It's okay if you have a thing. Also, episodes of Dr. Christian and Tombstone Territory. He wrote 2 other Harbor Command episodes prior to this one, and he went on to be both a writer and creative consultant on the Ron Ely Tarzan series of the late 60s, as well as a writer and story consultant on Columbo. He wrote episodes of The $6 Million Man, Tales of the Gold Monkey, and numerous made-for-TV movies. But how did both of their names end up on a story pitched by Gene alone? Stay tuned, because we can actually tell you exactly how. Right now, let's talk for a moment about the show itself. Harbor Command was a syndicated series produced by Ziv Television for the 1957-58 TV season and ran 39 half-hour episodes total. Though there's a lot of strong implication that the Harbor Command is the United States Coast Guard, nowhere are the words Coast Guard ever said. Why not? Because then you might be, metaphorically speaking, charting a path into waters that are patrolled by the Coast Guard itself. Fred Ziv had already done West Point and Men of Annapolis with oversight of those shows by, respectively, the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy. By skirting the issue of whether or not the Harbor Command is related to the Coast Guard, it's just this very non-specific, perhaps fictional entity with coastal law enforcement duties, a really soggy version of the Highway Patrol that doesn't need oversight from a branch of the armed forces. Wendell Corey, as Captain Ralph Baxter, the series lead, is one of those actors who had no problem dividing his time between big screen and small, with a list of credits stretching back to the 1940s. You could see him on the big screen in Women of the Prehistoric Planet, Cyborg 2087, or co-starring with Jimmy Stewart in Hitchcock's Rear Window. Following numerous TV Playhouse guest shots and his starring role in Harbor Command, you could see him in the likes of Peck's Bad Girl, The Untouchables, Perry Mason, or The Wild Wild West. We lost Wendell Corey in 1968. Guest starring as Leon Faulkner was John Vivian, who played guest roles on many a TV show: Maverick, The Lawless Years, Batman, Mr. Terrific, Petticoat Junction, and even later in shows such as WKRP in Cincinnati and Simon & Simon. As Dr. Ritter, the psychiatrist of the episode's title, we have something of a celebrity guest for this era. Big band leader Del Courtney, certainly better known for his music than his acting. His IMDb page lists only 5 acting roles, including this episode, but also notes that he and his band played at the inaugural celebrations of 4 presidents from Eisenhower to Reagan. During part of the 60s and the early part of the 70s, Del was the musical director for the Oakland Raiders. He was still playing at least 1 show a month, up until he was 93 years old. Even if he's a trivia note in 2024, In 1958, Del Courtney was kind of a big deal. Chronologically, this is almost Gene's final work with Ziv television programs to wind up on screen. Gene wrote an episode of Bat Masterson that aired in late 1958, for which we cannot find either the show itself or the script. West Point provided a year worth of regular employment as a staff writer, but as of mid-1957, Gene was back to freelancing, and he was not letting the grass grow beneath his feet. We're actually covering this episode of Harbor Command now, so we can close the book on the Ziv era of Gene's career before he moves on to greener pastures. Pastures roamed by Paladin, and pastures where Gene could have grown his very own series if history had played out slightly differently. And keep listening, because we'll be talking next week about what that series could have been.
I remember how furious Faulkner was when my brother testified. He was absolutely raging.
Did he say why he wanted to see Dr. Ritter?
No, but I know why. He came here to kill him.
How do you know?
He has a knife. I saw it. The moment he left, I called you.
You see which way he went?
I didn't look. I wanted you here when Albert comes back.
Comes back? From where?
The yacht club. He and his son went over there to...
What's wrong?
I told him. I told Faulkner where Albert and Tommy were going.
Try to help us. Where's the man that was here?
He was right here on the porch a few minutes ago. After your office called, I locked the door.
Search the area. Now, where is Dr. Ritter?
At the yacht club with Tommy. Good Lord. I told the man where he was.
Control 1 from 7020.
Control 1.
Control 1, urgent. Get a unit to the yacht club. Code 3. Also, check by phone if Dr. Ritter is there.
10-4.
Act 1. Leon Faulkner is a recently released ex-convict simmering with anger and resentment. He stops at a telephone booth, dialing the number of Dr. Albert Ritter, a psychiatrist whose testimony led to Faulkner's 10-year imprisonment. Faulkner's tense exchange with Etta, Ritter's sister, reveals his grave emotional instability. Shortly after, he returns to his boarding house, where he unpacks a strange parcel from his suitcase containing a switchblade knife and a newspaper article about Dr. Ritter, which, at the sight of it, enrages Faulkner to violently plunge his knife into the photo again and again and again. At the Ritter house, Dr. Ritter and his son Tommy head out for a boating trip and a little father and son time. Tommy is worried about leaving his Aunt Etta by herself, but she encourages them from the inside of the house to leave her be and to enjoy their day. Meanwhile, Captain Baxter of the Harbor Command and his colleague Warren investigate Faulkner's recent violent outburst at a rooming house after questioning the landlord, who was violently attacked by Leon before Faulkner fled. But where to? Back at the Ritter's house, Etta, sitting alone in her wheelchair, is visited and threatened by Faulkner, who at first was pretending to be just another patient. She inadvertently tells Leon where Albert has gone. After Faulkner leaves, Etta calls Baxter, but faints from the shock, realizing too late that she unwittingly revealed Ritter and his son's location to the vengeful Faulkner. After checking in on Etta, Baxter and Warren head towards the harbor and continue their pursuit in a patrol boat. As Faulkner closes in on his target, Ritter and his son, along with Tommy's friend Pete, reach Angel Island unaware of the imminent threat. Shortly after, Faulkner docks his boat next to Ritter's and sets out to exact his revenge. Act 2. While scouring the harbor, Baxter communicates urgently with the dock's dispatcher, learning of Dr. Ritter's whereabouts on Angel Island, where Faulkner has successfully stalked his prey. Ritter, who left Tommy and Pete on their own to explore the island, is walking down the main dirt road, where Faulkner threatens Ritter with his switchblade knife. Leon admits that he's there to exact his revenge upon the doctor for helping send him to prison. The situation intensifies as Faulkner learns about Ritter's son and uses it to inflict emotional pain. Ritter pleads for his son's safety, but Faulkner remains relentless, determined to make Ritter suffer. Ritter tries to fight back, but after a brief physical struggle, Leon's rage helps him gain the upper hand. However, Ritter claims that killing him won't do any good because it only hurts those left behind. This inspires Leon to turn his murderous intent towards Tommy instead. Leon knocks out Ritter with a haymaker punch, tucks away his knife, and begins scouring the island for Tommy and Pete. As Faulkner pursues Ritter's son, Tommy, and his friend Pete, a tense chase ensues on land and water. Tommy and Pete cleverly outmaneuver Faulkner using tree branches, sticks, stones, sand, and quick thinking to evade him. The police boat, with Baxter and Warren aboard, arrives just in time to thwart Faulkner's pursuit. In a final confrontation, Faulkner is apprehended, and he would have gotten away with his plans if it weren't for those meddling kids. As the police boat departs from Angel Island, Ritter, Tommy, and Pete watch with relief. Ritter expresses pride in his son's courage, while Baxter reflects on the events that unfolded. Despite the danger they faced, Tommy and Pete emerge victorious, their actions preventing a tragedy. The end.
Excellent job, Norm. I hope you harbor good feelings for this episode.
The grass was greener underneath my feet than in Faulkner's face. Let's just put it that way. Here's the question, and you brought this up you brought a point up in trivia I thought was interesting, that they didn't focus specifically on this being a Coast Guard story. But at the same time, since Ziv Productions has already done Mr. District Attorney and West Point, there's that obligatory credit slide in the beginning saying, "We gratefully dedicate this program to the men who constantly risk their lives fighting every danger to protect our harbor areas. We wish to thank the Port of San Francisco for its cooperation in making the authentic production of this picture possible." So my takeaways from this were, one, we definitely know where at least the series takes place. It's not like Anywhere Port USA. It was San Francisco. But two, to thank the capital men of the Harbor Patrol. So did women not serve in this organization?
I think the Harbor Patrol is kind of like the Wish-App Coast Guard.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're basically dealing with the Coast Guard here, except we're not going to call it the Coast Guard because then we are practically inviting, some slice of the Department of Defense to have oversight over the show. And I get the impression that with West Point and Men of Annapolis in the rearview mirror, Fred Ziv was ready to leave that behind. And remember, we have that quote from him, and this will come up later, this very specific quote from that book of interviews with various TV and film producers, that Fred Ziv did not like other people having oversight or influence over his
sense.
Shows.
I get it, yeah. I was saying that very tongue-in-cheek, of course. This isn't as progressive as an opening, dialogue as we're used to, so just one of those things. Just a timestamp it in 1957?
57, 58, but boy, it sure seems
58.
like a throwback to the earlier Ziv shows, doesn't it?
Yeah. I guess we're lucky enough to have both script form, the other script form, and the final finished film form of this episode. And when I read the script description of Leon Faulkner, then I see the guy who they cast as the actor, and reading the script while watching the episode side by side, there's a dramatic difference with what I thought Leon Faulkner was supposed to be based on just text and what Leon Faulkner was on screen. And I was like, it's not exactly what I wanted.
It reminded me so much of that Highway Patrol episode where they specify, this guy is 35 years old. Dude looked 47 if he was
right.
a day.
Right.
And it just reminded me a lot of that, of, people age differently back then. Full stop. That's all I'm going to say.
True. With Etta, I think Etta was described as a 50-year-old woman. But that's not what a 50-year-old woman, to me, today, would look like.
Right. It's very, very Mayberry. That's really the best way I could put it. It's casting out of a time and a place. People's personal habits and possibly the state of healthcare meant that aging just hit differently back in those days. Now, you mentioned that the show is specifically set in San Francisco. I definitely got that with Dr. Ritter's driveway. That driveway, the super steep driveway, where if you overshoot it, you're in the bay. That gave me so much anxiety throughout the show, especially when we get halfway through the show and the police car is just tearing out of there, taking that turn at the bottom of the driveway. I'm just like, yeah, don't miss the turn.
This is the prequel to The Streets of San Francisco.
It's more like the prequel to Crazy Taxi.
Yeah. That's definitely a landmark or a hallmark of kind of like the San Francisco or the Bay Area streets. Here's something, though, that, and we'll probably be referencing this back and forth during the course of these discussions, but there's one particular segment at the Ritter house that was completely taken out of the final filming, and it's strange, like the concessions that they would make in lieu of, say, longer car chases or longer patrol boat chases or longer panoramic establishing shots of, scenery or things like that. Because you mentioned the Ritter house, and this is where the scene is, where Tommy and his dad are talking about taking the boat out. And Tommy says, "Can I run the outboard motor today?" And his dad says, "Well, I don't know." And then he says, "Well, Pete Walker's going to meet us." And there's this back and forth going on, which explains why Pete's there at the end to begin with. But all of a sudden, he's just there. So I'm wondering, where these concessions were made during the course of, again, the script to screen production.
Television being a visual medium, I think the default position is always going to be, why tell when you could show? We have this island, or at least cove-like location. We've got a couple of boats. Let's concentrate our film coverage on that, and not explaining that Tommy has a friend.
Also, at the end of Act 1, in the script, Faulkner's already caught up to Ritter and is threatening him at knife point, which happens in the middle of Act 2. In this episode, Faulkner just parks the boat that he's on right next to Ritter's and sets out to the island on foot. It didn't seem as dramatic to me. But then again, I don't know how much they would have had to pad out Act 2 if the climax was at the end of Act 1.
The other possibility is, and we've discussed this with West Point, with things like parade formations and basketball games and what have you, some of this may be footage that's already in the can. Boats zooming around on the water. That may have been shot by second unit, separate from the rest of the show, and just use as much of this as you can, guys. Make shows out of it. And so it could be that we have all of this B-roll already in the can. Craft your stories around that. Here are the shots we have. Use this. We've already spent the money. There's this kind of outlandish line in Act 2, in the intro to Act 2. There is a third-person narrator, we should point out, who has this omniscient view of all of the events unfolding in this show. The narrator is not Paul Baxter. The narrator is just this completely different voice with a 30,000-foot view of the proceedings. He says, "A woman's weak heart kept the law from moving straight to the scene of the action." Is the narrator blaming this on Etta? On Ritter's sister? It's just such a bizarre line, and what gets really interesting about this line is that line was not in Gene's original script.
Yeah, it was a strange line to me, too. I made a note of this as well, because the reason why Baxter and Warren were actually able to catch up to Faulkner in one respect is because Etta told them where they were after she passed out from panic, being threatened by Faulkner. So it's not that she just held them up. They followed up on why she was in peril and passed out on the phone to begin with. It's not that all of a sudden she's describing something or serving them tea or lunch and then passes out and they're like, well, we can't leave her there because, she's in trouble. So, yeah, I found it very misleading. It was a little irresponsible for the narrator just to open up Act 2 with, well, they're not there. They haven't caught up to Faulkner because it's the lady's fault. Like, yes, that's not right.
You going to blame her, or are you going to thank her for having the information at all?
Exactly.
And, the situation you just described, where she could have just passed out in mid-conversation.
So on the island, Leon catches up with Ritter, flashes his knife. I guess there's a huge difference between a switchblade being brandished in 1957 and today, or even like in the 1980s when Crocodile Dundee laughs at something as dangerous, potentially, as a switchblade knife, of which to Mick Dundee was just a toy. But in the 1950s, in 1957, switchblade duels were a thing, right? We saw that in a lot of kind of like the movies of the time. And I guess they were threatening, but not as visually lethal looking as a gun. So you can get away with it maybe a little bit more on TV.
As threatened as everyone was by that switchblade knife, you would think it was a bazooka.
Yeah. It was a big deal, but it's kind of not, right? So...
Family hour viewing, man. Family hour viewing.
True. And that's a really good point. So, but the thing is, when Ritter's being held at knife point, either he, the doctor, in the show was super brave, or the actor, was it Del
Courtney, yeah.
Del Courtney didn't really, I don't know, emulate a lot of emotion in that scene.
This is actually a big criticism of mine with this episode, and I'll get to this in discussion. But, again, going back to trivia, Del Courtney was not an actor. He was kind of a bit of stunt casting for this episode. Oh, hey, look, we've got this guy you've heard on the radio. I don't know how fair it is to expect a lot of emoting from him.
That's all that's fair to say, but also I think we're talking about these 39 episode seasons running out of gas. Was stunt casting like this a way for advertisers to continue to support these shows?
Well, I mean, it gives your promotions department something to seize onto. I mean, we are so accustomed from our growing up with TV of our era, a very special episode. Or right. Big name, guest stars on this week's whatever. That's always a thing you can say, and that's why that happens. It's there to kind of gin up interest in the show when it might otherwise be flagging.
The last thing I have to say before we jump into this really wonderful segment that you have here, I just have to, because I can't let it go, I just have to mention, for anyone who watches this, how much I'm not excited about Baxter's action wardrobe. I mean, so he's running around on a boat and then on an island in a white trench coat and a driver's cap, circa turn of the century. The only thing that he's really missing are goggles. So I'm not on board with that. It took a lot of the toughness out of his character in a way.
Yeah, it seems like he could have gotten to the island faster if he left the boat at home and just loaded up his flying car with flubber. It's kind of what it put me in mind of. It really made me think of that.
A little more Phineas Fogg than Captain Baxter, right?
Yeah, exactly. Action Baxter. Action not included. If I might be allowed to extend some more trivia into this segment. Unlike a lot of what we have covered so far in Gene-ology, we actually have at our disposal here an early draft of the script, and in fact the brief story pitch that won Gene the scriptwriting assignment. And it's only Gene's name on those documents, without William Driscoll. With these documents in hand, we can do some detective work and figure out the history of this particular episode in a way that we really have not been able to do with some of the previous shows we've covered on Gene-ology. The pitch document is dated May 7th, 1957, so a point where West Point was still on the air, but Gene's work on West Point was probably finished. This pitch document has only Gene's name on it and is titled Danger at Sea. That story outline involves an escaped death row inmate named Leon Taggart, who is obviously not supposed to be out of jail. There's a scene involving Taggart beating up a naval officer and stealing his uniform and ID to get past a roadblock. But after that, much of the plot is the same as the final revised script with Driscoll's rewrites, with some differences. Instead of a tiny motorboat, Dr. Ritter and his son have a yacht with a little outboard. But that would cost more money, and I'm sure you can see where it was decided to scale things back for cost, which is kind of the flip side of, we've spent all this money getting all this boat footage. Use it, boys. The ending involves Baxter boarding the boat stolen by Taggart to ram the yacht with Ritter's son in it, which is Taggart is trying to kill Ritter's son. And there's a big 50s fist fight, and, of course, Baxter comes out on top. That pitch won Gene the assignment to write the script, which, as was often the case with Gene's earlier scripts for Ziv, a script with a number and not a title at all. The first draft is dated May 20th, 1957, and follows that outline closely, with almost twice as many speaking parts as you see in the final show. You'll notice that one thing that changes drastically from the outline and the first draft to the final episode as aired is that not only has the Navy been removed from the plot, but any mention of the Navy has been surgically removed from the script. My theory as to what happened here is that, remember that in the 56-57 season alongside West Point, Ziv was also producing a show called Men of Annapolis about the Naval Officers Academy. And much like the Army did with West Point, the Navy had approval over episodes and production details of Men of Annapolis. Now, for one thing, if the show becomes about the Navy, then the Navy might be knocking on Ziv's door demanding oversight. And since Leon Taggart apparently beats up a naval officer, bests him in a fight, perhaps it doesn't paint the Navy in the best light, so let's lose the Navy completely from this story. Also, lose a lot of the police presence. The Harbor Command, at least in this episode, seems to consist of one car and one patrol boat, maybe about 4 guys. So it's highway patrol meets patrol boat. In fact, you'll notice one key difference is in between the pitch and the first draft. Leon has escaped from prison. However, with highway patrol still in production on the Ziv lot, they may have decided to change that detail so as not to make law enforcement look bad. We're still counting on that law enforcement oversight and assistance with this other show that's being produced on the same lot. The revised script, now with William Driscoll's name on it, is dated February 12th, 1958. Leon Taggart, escaped killer, is now Leon Faulkner, who has just finished serving a jail sentence for manslaughter. So, not a bad guy, but he has served his sentence, and this way law enforcement still gets to look reasonably good. Dr. Ritter's nervous housekeeper is now Dr. Ritter's sister with a heart condition, and this is where that lamentable line about, a woman's weak heart appears in the script. It appears in the Driscoll draft. With all of this information in mind, it seems very likely that Driscoll, who had 2 previous Harbor Command scripts under his belt already, was brought in to do rewrites. Now, it's safe to assume from the 58 air date that this script sat in Ziv's slush pile for most of 57, and by the end of that year, by the end of 57, Gene was fast becoming one of the most frequent freelancers writing for Have Gun Will Travel. We'll get there soon, trust me, don't worry. So Gene simply may not have been available to revise anything. He may have been busy, and so it got handed off to another writer. And who knows, maybe this incident led to a change in Gene's relationship with Ziv? But that's pure speculation on my part. Driscoll was very likely engaged to do the necessary rewrites to get the Psychiatrist ready to film in early 58 for broadcast during the summer months, but even then, the script was not filmed as written. And just so you know, the air date on this episode was June 20th, 1958. Okay, everybody, I hope you can forgive this giant iceberg of production trivia that's kind of taking over our discussion of this episode. You may or may not have noticed, Norm, your mileage may vary here. The episode itself really isn't much to discuss without the production trivia.
Yeah, no, that's fair to say. I think that one of the things I struggled with after watching this episode was trying to come up with anything that wasn't like beyond obvious from kind of like a forced perspective. What I mean by that is it's so paint by numbers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, when it comes to entertainment. We are dealing with entertainment for a certain audience in 1957, and it's formulaic, and it's route, and it is transparent, and all of those things that I think may not have been as obvious in 1957 when you're watching this for the very first time as a family show. So it's hard to find the drama in a show like this when perhaps there wasn't that much drama to begin with, as opposed to just being an entertainment vehicle for advertising revenue. I mean, I think that's fair to say. And it's not a bad or a good thing. It's just an obvious thing.
Stunts cost money. Action costs money.
Sure.
And any show, then or now, is going to be dealing with that reality.
So let's put this up against Highway Patrol, because Mr. District Attorney, Highway Patrol, and now Harbor Command, they have this one central, almost kind of like homogenous character, the leader character. Now, at least Broderick Crawford's Dan Matthews had a name. Mr. District Attorney didn't have a name. Baxter has a name, but he doesn't really have a presence. So I think that Dan Matthews is the most successful of this archetype, but it still is an archetype. It's this central leader that helps anchor the story, whatever that story may be. Your mileage may vary from script to script, and to be fair to us, we haven't seen every single episode of these 3 specific Ziv seasons of TV. So they could have been better. They could have been worse. They could have been just par for the course like we're watching. It's formulaic. That's, again, not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just a it's what's thing.
So you're saying, Norm, is that we are Baxter Basics.
No, you're going to get all the credit for that one.
Yeah, get out. After so many episodes of West Point, though, that seemed like they were head and shoulders above this kind of central law enforcement authority figure show that Ziv specialized in, it was kind of painful to have this throwback a whole year later to this less nuanced feel of the traditional syndicated Ziv show. Actually, there were episodes of Highway Patrol, and I think you and I could probably rattle off the titles that had more nuance than this one, where basically we have this Scooby-Doo resolution that is solved by a pocket sand from King of the Hill.
Or a whipping tree branch.
Yeah, exactly. You never mind the bazooka, we've got a tree branch.
That being said, though, Earl, if it were filmed the way that Gene scripted it, at least it would have had a more satisfying resolution than I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for these meddling kids.
One wonders, in losing the powerboat chases in Gene's original draft, one wonders if maybe it included with whether or not Gene was available to revise his own script, if there wasn't some issue of, you know what, we've already spent the money for this season. We've got to have a couple of do-gooder pipsqueaks defeat evil this week. We can't afford blanks, so we can't fire a shot. The worst weapon that's going to show up in this is going to be a switchblade. And we can barely afford the boats. Take it easy on us.
Did the stunt casting eat the budget? Do you think that was the issue here?
I can't imagine that it did. I hope he didn't charge excessively for his services, because there is almost no tension whatsoever in the confrontation between Faulkner and Dr. Ritter. Now, knowing that Del Courtney was not an actor or was only dabbling in acting, it makes it kind of hard to judge his performance here. His band got to play for newly sworn-in presidents of the United States. That's no small feat. But as an actor, he doesn't act scared or angry that Faulkner, has him pinned down to the ground with a knife in hand and then is talking about, oh yeah, and now I'm going to kill your kid. He's acting mildly inconvenienced that there's a guy trying to kill him. There's no tension whatsoever. There's no fear. He's not selling the fear of the situation. To point this up, that knife in hand, face-to-face confrontation, that barely happens in Gene's script. It's really a feature of the Driscoll script, taking the place of a boat chase, which would have ended with Baxter jumping from one speeding boat to another. Which, there's a stunt that's not going to cost anything. So you kind of see where we wound up. I feel like perhaps more than specifically we're running out of steam on story ideas, I think we're running out of budget toward the end of this show season. We're 2 shows away from the end of the season and from the end of the series.
Yeah.
And we've got a tank full of fumes and that's it.
Yeah, when you bring somebody like a professional from another line of work, another completely different mode of entertainment, it tends to show, even if someone who's watching it would snap their fingers and say, hey, I know who that is. Let's see what he can do. And sometimes seeing that kind of celebrityism as a guest performance, as stunt casting, that does a lot of the heavy lifting for the fact that they can't act. And that the reason why they're acting the way that they're acting is because they're trying to actually get their line right. They're just trying to hit a mark, right? They're trying to do things that they are normally not practiced in doing. There was this great interview that I saw with Gary Oldman about actors and celebrities or athletes being cast in roles that should go to actors. And I think that I agree with 100%. He said, look, I don't have any problem with who they are and their profession. My problem, I'm paraphrasing Gary's, he was describing, is they are not trained professionals in my art. They are not trained professionals in the craft that I have spent my entire career trying to improve over time. So don't expect me to go out there and play basketball or football, at a professional level just because I have the clout to be able to talk to somebody who knows somebody to get me on the field. Something to that effect. And I agree with that, right? You can tell, unless there is an extremely, extremely rare example of that kind of threshold crossover, you can tell when somebody shouldn't be there and it affects the entire work and takes it down a notch.
Well, and this is why a popular stunt casting throughout the 70s was Wolfman Jack. But you know what? Generally speaking, they wrote him in as Wolfman Jack.
Exactly.
Doing Wolfman Jack things.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally, you get an example, the Next Gen episode Gambit, where they have that really tall Klingon, and he was a basketball player. But really, just his sheer size, that's the whole character. He has almost no lines because he's just staring at everyone and being really tall. Well, okay, a basketball player is good for that.
That was James Worthy, wasn't it?
Yes.
James Worthy from the Lakers. Yeah. I remember that.
And that worked. And that worked because you have this Klingon standing there, and Worf is just like, I'll come up and have a discussion with you. Let me go get a ladder first.
Right.
But when you put someone who may be great at what they do from outside the discipline of acting, and you put them in there, now I don't know how much of a seasoned performer Wendell Corey was, but he certainly has more of a CV than Del Courtney. Or even John Vivian, the guy who played Faulkner. He had kind of very genteel version of smoldering intensity going on. We start the episode with him stabbing a mattress. There's some intensity there, but then you have a band leader. You show up in a critical, dramatic role. And when the Harbor Command finds Dr. Ritter, and, he's been roughed up, He mentions that Faulkner wants to kill his son, but he passes this information, this exposition, along to our central characters with all the gravitas of an invite to his next backyard cookout. I mean, honestly, the kids sell it better than Del Courtney does. You get a sense that they're like, oh, their stranger danger sensors are working. Weird guy shows up and they have no idea what he wants with him. They take off running. Good for them. Good for them. They're selling the danger.
All right.
And unfortunately, our visiting guest star, who's really... he's the weak point that sinks this whole boat.
But you think if you actually had an experienced actor in the role, is the script or the script changes, were they strong enough to be able to justify a better story in the end? Or do you think we would have just had a more memorable role?
We might have had a more memorable take on the role. The closest Del really gets to any intensity is when he is struggling with Faulkner and he says, "You're insane." There still could have been more intensity there. So I'm not saying that the script wasn't already compromised by the many changes that had been made to it, possibly in the name of budget, possibly because Gene was not available to do the revisions personally. It was already going to be compromised in that respect, but the performance compromises it even more. All right, Norm, we have reached the end of our very short tour of duty with Harbor Command. It was definitely no West Point.
We were spoiled with West Point, for sure.
We had it so good.
But to be fair, though, we've only really kind of waded through shallow waters with Harbor Command, if you will. And, there's that word, shallow. Maybe I'll pivot that into the morals, meanings, or message segment, because just like Mission Log, the standard Mission Log show with John and I, sometimes episodes just don't have it. And they're not required to. This is like what we do. Like, we look for these things because, originally, Star Trek, the original series, that was under the provenance of Gene, and so was a certain era of the Next Generation in some of the movies. So that was the focus. But it doesn't necessarily always happen, and that's just the law of averages. And that goes probably more so for this early part of his career, West Point being probably one of the greater exceptions to the rule that we've seen so far. So, was there a moral meaning or message in this episode? There was a decent line in this episode. I will give this episode that. And it wasn't delivered well, but it was written well. Now, Ritter says to Leon Faulkner, which kind of gives Leon Faulkner a better idea in order to exact his revenge. Ritter says, death doesn't hurt the one it takes. It only hurts the one it leaves behind. For me, knowing where the script went and how some of the steam was taken out of the actual final episode, the way it was filmed, this line seems to me a very Gene line because it has a lot of potential moral to it. But the way it was executed on film, not so much. So that took a lot of the wind out of the potential of a moral meaning or message. It didn't really go any further than that, but it's a good idea. I actually think that you can make a case for the empowerment for children because the kids actually caught the criminal. And I thought that was kind of neat. And if you were a kid back then, it would have been neat watching that. So there's something there. I am trying so hard to throw it a buoy or a lifeline. But the thing is, I found more of a message overall. And it's allowing us to reflect on Gene as a writer. Because we have seen such an interesting bell curve in the quality of his writing from when he first started to, say, West Point, which is right now for us the high watermark of his career. With the exception, I will say, of The Secret Defense of 117, which I think is an anomaly so far in his writing career from 1956 to 1958. So it's hard to believe that he's written so much variety in that span of time and the volume. But I guess when you're a hungry writer, you're writing whatever you need to do in order to get your script sold, right? So, and I'm not saying that, like, Mr. District Attorney was bad or Highway Patrol was bad and Harbor Command. They're not bad scripts. They're just not unique scripts, right? And I feel like any decent or competent writer in the business could have written these stories. The ones where they're just not signature Gene Roddenberry-esque stories. Now, in kind of like today's comparison, if you give ChatGPT the right parameters, it can produce, quote-unquote, a script, but it will probably take some time before it has the kind of emotional weight and gravitas like a Casablanca, or a Godfather or a Chinatown level of script. And I will say that Gene gets to that level eventually, with especially several key episodes under his career. But some of you may not realize, or you may, that the script that I wrote for the recap was enhanced by ChatGPT. I had it do a little bit of cleanup, do a little bit of the summarization, and it did a decent job with the right parameters, but it didn't quite grab the concepts of the emotion in the thrust of the narrative, and I had to go in there and make sure that those beats were accurate. That's how I feel about Gene's writing at the start. Before he started to expand on his overall talent, his scripts were very rudimentary. Of course they would be. He doesn't have the experience yet. But the thing is that with West Point, in comparison, we're seeing where he's actually starting to emerge, and then we're getting really close to seeing him develop even further with Have Gun Will Travel and The Lieutenant. So, yeah, this was, in our parlance, you and I, Earl, this script, it's what's. That's it.
And I landed really on the same square of the board with you, Norm. There is virtually no detectable sign that this is Gene's work. I know we have another writer in here, and, let me say this about Mr. Driscoll. I'm not trying to dogpile the whole thing on him. But in this script, there really is no redemptive or hopeful message. There's no bucking of societal norms to examine them to see if they're actually doing society any favors. There's just a bad guy. A really bad guy. We know he's the bad guy because the narrator tells us he's a bad guy. So bad he makes a woman faint. He gets defeated by two 11-year-old boys, and the cops haul him off. And never mind, it's no West Point. This isn't even Mental Patient. I will admit that I have not watched any other episodes of Harbor Command to see if it gets better than this, but this episode certainly doesn't make me want to sample the rest of the show. My mind goes back to that interview with Frederick Ziv in Irv Broughton's book Producers and Producing, and how dead set Ziv was about... He was dead set against network interference, in his words. And yet the one show that Ziv produced that Gene wrote for that did have network involvement, that was the best of the shows we've watched so far for this podcast. By miles. Ziv talks about his demand for creative autonomy. Okay, great, I get that. But if creative autonomy in his world is turning out the same show in different guises over and over again, sorry, Fred, let's have more network involvement, please. This episode of Harbor Command should be examined for its remarkable time travel ability because it made me feel like this was a leftover Mr. D.A. script from '54, and not a show from 4 years into Gene's career when he's done much better. It does not hold up, but as we now know, it was heavily rewritten by someone other than Gene, so perhaps expecting it to hold up to the West Point episodes that were very, very Gene, that's just not a fair comparison. I speculated in observations that Gene perhaps being unavailable to revise his script may have caused the end of his relationship with Ziv. But it could also be that Gene decided not to do any further work for Ziv of his own accord. When you know that your best efforts to create a dramatic, entertaining scenario will always be subject to being watered down, to continue the water metaphor here, just to keep Ziv's budget and its 30-hour shooting week schedule, you're getting regular work on one of the hottest network westerns of the 57-58 season at the same time. Do you dance with the one who brought you? Or do you, to extend the metaphor into the Western, change horses midstream? Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory Players. Our cast this week featured Mike Richards as Captain Baxter, Amy Nelson as the Housekeeper and Etta, and Elliot Kronsberg as the Control Voice. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com. On the next Gene-ology, the man from Texas.
Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.